Thank you all for coming. Just to introduce myself, I'm Steve Davies, the Education Director at the IEA, as those of you at the previous session will have gathered. I'm a historian by profession, which is why this is going to have a strongly historical bent, amongst other things, the lecture you're about to hear. And I've been associated with the IEA and the wider freedom movement since I was an undergraduate at St Andrews University in the early 1970s. I hope you all realise that I'm really dedicated to the cause because I'm choosing to be here with you rather than sat in the pub watching my team, which, of course, since I come from Manchester, is City. Now, one of the big challenges for anyone who believes in minimal government is the question or the argument that there are certain kinds of key services, goods in the economist language, which can and should only be provided by government. I'll come back to the distinction between can and should, by the way, later on. And this is encapsulated in the kind of what are meant to be rhetorical questions, like the one that we have as the title of this session: who will build the roads? But you can substitute other things to that. Who will do the police? Who will provide the running water? Who will provide the general infrastructure? Who will provide the essential kind of core services upon which the whole of civilized life it depends? And this is a serious challenge. And it's a challenge which derives ultimately actually from economics. And this is because it's based upon what is known as the theory of public goods. And I should explain that, unfortunately, this is one of those areas where the language of the economists is in sharp contradistinction to the way in which words are used in common English. So when people talk about a public good, what they generally mean is something that is good for all of the public. When economists talk about public goods, they have something quite different in mind. They have in mind products, services, which have certain distinctive features. And allegedly, it's these features which mean that they can or should be provided primarily by the state through the tax mechanism rather than by private action of one kind or another. Now, there are actually two ways of defining public goods in the economics literature, one of which is quite recent, the other much older. The recent one, which is the one you get in all the textbooks, is the definition given by the late Paul Samuelson in a paper he published in the 1950s called Towards a Pure Theory of Public Expenditure. And the title of that paper tells you what Samuelson was trying to do. He was trying to work out at a highly abstract level exactly what it was that governments ought to do, and therefore, when you plug this model into any particular time and place, what proportion of the GDP ought to be spent by the government. And for Samuelson, the key thing about public goods was that they were goods which had two qualities. The first was that they had what's called non-rivalrous consumption, or in other words, they're collective goods. That's quite an easy concept to get around. If I have a Mars bar and I eat that Mars bar, there's nothing for you. So my consumption is rivalrous. Either I eat the Mars bar or somebody else does it, unless you're Marianne Faithfull or Mick Jagger, but let's not go into that. Now, the alternative is goods like, for example, listening to this lecture here. As long as there are seats available, that's a non-rivalrous consumption good. If somebody else comes in and sits down beside you to listen to me talking here, that doesn't interfere with or stop you enjoying it. So that's non-rivalrous consumption. The really crucial feature of the public good, however, for Samuelson, is that they have the quality of non-excludability. Now, that works in the following way. With most goods, you can exclude people who have not paid for the good from benefiting from it. So if, for example, I am running a restaurant, I can limit people eating food in the restaurant to those who have paid or have had somebody else pay for them. By contrast, goods that have the quality of non-excludability benefit everyone regardless of whether or not they've paid for them. So let's take a definitive and classic case. Suppose I live on a street where there's no street lighting. And eventually I'm fed up with the fact that I'm constantly stepping in dog mess when I walk home. And I, out of my own pocket, put up a street light outside my house. At this point, everyone who lives on the street, at least within range of the light, benefits from it. I can't rush out of my front door every time somebody walks past and demand that they pay me for the street light and stop them getting the benefit if they don't. So this is the quality, in other words, of non-excludability. Once a good of this kind is provided, everyone enjoys that good and benefits from it, regardless of whether or not they paid. Now, in Samuelson's model, using neoclassical assumptions about rational actors and the like, what this means is that you have something called the free rider problem, which is that given that you're going to enjoy this good anyway, regardless of whether you pay for it, why should you pay for it? Why not let somebody else bear the cost of providing it and you just free ride? In other words, as it's actually put in the literature, why be a sucker? The problem, of course, is that then nobody provides it, or it's provided suboptimally. You get less of the good provided than people would really want if they could be sure that everyone was paying for it and they weren't going to be ripped off by free riders. Indeed, this often happens. I live on a road which, when I first moved there, was unmetalled, it was unmade up. And we worked out that if each household put in about 150 to 200 pounds, we could get the road made up and it would be, usable instead of full of potholes that would swallow up a fair-sized car, which it was. The trouble was there were always some people who basically weren't prepared to contribute because they took this rational economic view. Why should I pay 200 quid when I'll get the benefit of the free road anyway if everybody else does it? And of course people weren't prepared to subsidise their neighbour's car suspension to that degree, so it didn't get done. So Samuelson's argument is therefore that goods of this kind are going to be provided suboptimally. You're not going to get as much of them as people actually really want. And so therefore, he says, they have to be provided by the government. You have to basically use the coercive power of the tax system to make sure that everyone who can afford to contribute does so under the threat of various kinds of sanctions. And only when it's done that way will you get the right amount of the good. The other definition of public goods is from Adam Smith. It goes back to Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations. Smith's definition is interestingly different from Samuelson's, and it's rather more subtle, characteristically. Smith thinks that public goods are goods where the major benefits that you get do not accrue to the person who provides the good. In other words, the profit that you make from providing the good is only a very small fraction of the total benefits to society as a whole. And his argument, therefore, is that these goods will often not be provided, or provided again suboptimally, because it's not worth the while of somebody doing it. The example he gives is a bridge. Suppose I build a bridge between two towns on either side of a river. I will capture some of the benefit because I can charge tolls on the bridge. But Smith's argument is that the actual benefit to the towns on both sides is far, far larger than the amount that I managed to capture. And his argument is that if the amount I can capture is too low, I won't bother building the bridge, because I can't go around and collect the goods. It's important to notice that Smith's definition of a public good is wider than Samuelson's. Certain kinds of goods that would not count as public goods in the Samuelson definition do for Smith, notably education, because education is clearly an excludable good. If I'm running a private school, I can basically say you only get educated if your parents pay fees or if you pay fees. So it's an excludable good. So it shouldn't count as a public good in Samuelson's definition, and indeed it doesn't actually. Whereas for Smith, it is a public good. He explicitly says this, in fact, because the wider societal benefits of general education are not captured to a sufficient degree, he thought, by the educational providers. So characteristically, I think, Smith's view of this is actually rather more subtle, in many ways more interesting. So that's the challenge for libertarians, people who think that the government should have a very minimal or limited role in society. What about these goods which, according to the economic theorists, two of the greatest economists actually, in different ways, just either can't be provided by private action, or if they are provided, will be provided in an inadequate way because of inevitable features of human nature and the world in which we live? Well, this is where the historians come in, because what the historians can show is that, in fact, goods of this kind are and have been provided privately, and you can say on a comparative basis perfectly adequately. Now I'm just going to give you some examples, some real life examples of how this has been done before I move on to talking about what the implications of this are and how we might think about applying these kind of principles in the future. The first is the actual one of roads and infrastructure. The actual one which is alluded to in the title of my talk here. Now, if you went back to 17th century or early 18th century England, what you had was a system where the roads were supposed to be kept up by the local government, the parish, in fact. Every parish was under an obligation to keep the roads that ran through it in working order, and this was meant to be met by what the French called a corvée, which is a labour tax. If you were an adult in the parish, part of your tax burden was to go out a number of days in the year and patch up the roads. So how did this work? Not at all. The roads in 18th century England, this is true throughout Europe, by the way, were in a terrible state. Basically, they were completely impassable between the months of October and March because they just turned into a quagmire. The time it took to travel by land was quite remarkable. To get from London to Newcastle, for example, would take you well over a week by land. And it would, whereas by sea it took a couple of days, of course. You could just sail straight up the Thames and up the East Coast and up the Tyne. Not only that, but there were some other very striking consequences. One of them was that in each county in England, generally speaking, there was a conventional, traditional length for the axles of a cart. So in County Durham, for example, the wheels on a cart were typically 4 foot 8.5 inches apart. That's why that's the standard gauge for railway lines around the world, because that was the width of cart axles on the Durham collieries around Stockton and Darlington, where the first commercial railway was built. Now, the trouble was, over in North Yorkshire, the width of the axles was quite different. And what this meant was that within any one county, you would find that there were deep ruts in the road at roughly the distance of the standard axles in that part of the country. But when you got to the place where the convention for building carts changed, you found that the ruts were in the wrong place. And the result was that if you tried to use a cart, the axles would snap and you wouldn't get anywhere. So what had to happen if you wanted to trade goods from, say, Durham to Northallerton in North Yorkshire is that you'd have to take one cart down to the Tees and then transship all the goods into another cart, which, as you can imagine, raised the cost of trade enormously. So what was the solution to this? The solution was private action through what were called turnpike trusts. A turnpike trust was a private association of people organised in order to take over sections of the road and turn them into toll roads. So suppose we all live in an area of rural Britain at this time, or indeed urban Britain, and we are fed up with the fact that the road's quality is so utterly abysmal. What we do is we meet, almost certainly in a pub, where else, and we form a turnpike trust. We then apply to Parliament for what is called a private act of Parliament. And that converts a designated section of the highway into a turnpike. We then, the trust, take over running that road, and we collect tolls for the right to travel along it. Now, what we also do, though, is issue debt. We sell debt to the public, which attracts an interest rate of about between 5 and 7% normally, which is a pretty good rate of return. It's about double the rate of return on government stock at the time, which is about 3%. And we use this to improve the road. Now, what is the result of all this? Well, the result is that between about 1750 and 1800, tens of thousands, literally, of these turnpike trusts were set up. By the time you get to the 1820s, the road system in Britain has been utterly and totally transformed. And Britain has a system of roads which is denser and of higher quality than anywhere else in Europe. The French, by contrast, went in for what were called post roads built by the monarchy, by the government, which meant that you had 4 or 5 really big, excellent, high-quality roads radiating out of Paris to places like Strasbourg, Brest, Bordeaux, Toulon, the main function of which was to enable the king to march his troops rapidly to the borders to put down provincial rebellions. But there were no minor roads. So these roads did not benefit your average Frenchman. By contrast, in England, you have a dense network of roads, including increasingly minor roads, which are constructed by this private mechanism. Not only that, but what you got was significant innovation, because the trusts are in many ways competing with each other. And what they do is they introduce all kinds of innovations in the way roads were built, the way they were maintained. So, for example, Macadam, an engineer who worked for a turnpike trust up in Dumfriesshire in Scotland, invented the principle of macadamization, which is, of course, the using bitumen and crushed stone to surface the road to provide a surface which is both hard-wearing and resilient, crucial combination of qualities. Enormous breakthrough in road engineering technology. They developed techniques for providing a proper camber on the road so that the water will not lie in big puddles but will go off to the edge and drain away naturally. They work out how to build roads in ways that take advantage of the natural contours of the land so that you don't have steep inclines wherever it's possible to avoid doing this. They'd even begun to invent the bypass and the motel and the motorway service station by the time Turnpike Trust came to an end in the 1850s. They actually come to an end, by the way, which is a story I don't have time to go into right now, because of an amazing piece of outrageous legislative lobbying by the stagecoach companies, which I could tell you more about that later on. The point is that here you have a system of purely private action providing a public good, infrastructure in this case, highways, very effectively, and in the process completely transforming the British economy. One of the major books on this subject, Pownall's Turnpike Roads in England, estimates that the cost of moving goods around the country was reduced by a factor of a half. They became half as costly to move goods around the country. And in some parts of the country, in fact, the cost of moving goods around fell to as low as a tenth of what it had been before. Because of the improvement in the quality of the roads. And also the speed at which you could move goods around by land increased dramatically, and this played a major part in industrialization and economic growth in 18th century England. It's also worth pointing out that this was a bottom-up process. You did not have a top-down plan in which people in the government worked out where they wanted the big trunk roads to go. Instead, it was done at a grassroots level, where people in a very small locality would improve their local road, the people in the neighbouring locality would then do theirs, and so quite spontaneously, from the bottom up, emerges a national road system, which had not been designed or planned by any committee of experts in the then equivalent of Whitehall or anywhere else, but which rather reflected local needs, local demands, local aspirations and the like. The same is true, by the way, of the railway system, which is built up in exactly the same way, of course, at a slightly later date. This is in contrast, by the way, to the way the road system has been developed in the last 70 or 80 years, since the Department of Transport was set up by the Baldwin government in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the Department of Transport devised a national transportation plan, which involved plans for motorways and roads all over the UK. Quite a few of these planned roads have still not been built. And the cost of building them has been enormous and extortionate, whereas the cost of building the turnpikes was borne by private investors who purchased the debt of the turnpike trusts. So that was one example. Now, another example, which is in many ways even more striking, I think, for a contemporary observer, was the way in which law and order was met and police services were provided before the creation of the state police force. You have to realise that although the first police force is created in 1829 in London by Robert Peel as Home Secretary, you don't have police forces in the great majority of British counties and boroughs until the County and Borough Police Act of 1856. So before then, there is no state-funded police force. What this means is that the task of investigating crime is borne by the victims. Now, that is actually highly problematic because the cost of taking a case to the assize court, which is where serious crimes are tried, is, in the 18th century, about £65. Now, this is a time when the average annual income is £50. So you're talking about spending more than the year's average income. Now, the maths of this are quite straightforward. Suppose I have a watch stolen, and that watch is worth £20. Is it worth my while spending £65 to prosecute the person who's stolen my watch? Almost certainly not. And the result is that, therefore, most criminals are never prosecuted. And that has very serious results. One of the consequences is that in order to deter criminals, the punishments inflicted on those who were caught and prosecuted had to be utterly savage, with the result that by 1815 there were 250 capital crimes, which is, when you think about it, quite an extraordinary kind of figure. You could be hanged for stealing any goods worth more than 3 shillings and sixpence. That counted as grand larceny and meant if you were convicted, you would go on the long ride from Newgate Prison to Tyburn. Now, in response to this, though, what you get is the emergence of what are called prosecution associations. How does that work? Well, suppose we're all in a village and we're fed up with the fact that there's a bunch of sheep thieves around there, nipping across the border from Wales to take away the sheep. So what do? We all meet together, again, almost certainly in the pub, and we form ourselves into an association, which is like a club. What the club does is collect subscriptions from all of us, and these subscriptions are pretty low cost. The way it works then is this. If you are the victim of a crime, you go to the secretary of the association. And the secretary will then do a number of things. They will pay for a private detective to investigate the crime. They will advertise in the free papers for the recovery of the stolen goods. If the person is apprehended, then the funds will pay for the cost of a prosecution. So this is essentially an insurance mechanism by which the good of prosecuting criminals, the undoubted public good, is provided by free associations of people who club together to pool their risks, essentially, and also their unlimited resources to generate the money they need to pay for a criminal investigation and, if necessary, a criminal prosecution. Now, these are highly effective. How do we know this? Well, because when you're a member, one of the things you get is a kind of metal plaque which is affixed to the side of your house. And we know, because of household insurance records, that insurance companies would offer a discount to people who belonged to a prosecution association. And the reason, when you think about it, is quite obvious. If I'm a burglar and I look up at a house and I see one house here which has a plaque saying member in good standing of the West Buckinghamshire County Association for the Prosecution of Felons, and the other one doesn't, which house am I going to rob? I'm going to rob the one that doesn't have the plaque, because I know that the chances that I will be prosecuted are much higher if I rob someone who belongs to a prosecution association. And the insurance companies know this, and therefore they offer discounts to people who belong to associations. Now, these associations exist in literally thousands of them. And by the time you get to the 1820s or 1830s, some of them are really quite large. One of the biggest is in Barnet in Hertfordshire, run by a chap called Thomas Dimsdale. The Barnet Association has well over 1,000 members. Average membership is about 70 to 80. So this is a really big one, and this is the trend that we can see in the 1820s and 1830s, a move towards much larger associations which are nationally linked and connected. Not only that, but also what you find is that these larger associations are offering what are genuine public goods. So the Barnet Association, for example, has foot patrols, which walk around the streets, keep an eye out, watch everybody's property, and keep an eye out for undesirable characters getting up to no good. Now, the point is, of course, that this is a pure public good, because even if I have not contributed to the association or joined it, I still benefit from this public order policing that the association is providing. So why does it still exist? Because surely this flouts the principle that Samuelson had articulated in his famous paper. It's a non-excludable good, public policing, so why is anybody bothering to actually make the contributions? Well, the answer is because the other good, the good of insurance essentially, coverage against the cost of being robbed, is a private good, an excludable one. So what you have done is you've bundled up the public good with a private good, and by doing that you're able to provide it voluntarily. Now, you may ask, well, okay, Davies, if these associations were doing such a great job and were developing so well, why did the government introduce the state police force, and why did they finally bring in the County and Borough Police Act? And there's actually quite a broad consensus amongst the historians about the answer to that. When the big Royal Commission on the Constabulary was brought out in 1842, the secretary, a chap called Edwin Chadwick, was basically given a brief by Lord John Russell, the Home Secretary, to write a report coming to certain conclusions. And if you look at the actual report, it appears as a desperate need for a national publicly funded police force. When you actually look at the papers and the evidence that was submitted, it turns out that 80% of the respondents to the Royal Commission said they had no need for a state police force. They didn't want to do it, but Chadwick completely ignored them and only used the selections, almost all from London, by the way, which supported it. Why did they want to do it, though? Why did Lord John Russell and the government want to introduce a state police force? Well, it's because of what they saw as a serious lack in the prosecution associations. What were their members interested in prosecuting? They were interested in prosecuting thieves, people who committed assaults, people who committed murder, people who stole horses, particularly that. That, by the way, was the one certain way of getting hanged. If you stole a horse, that was it. They were going to hang you. What they were not interested in prosecuting was moral crimes. They were not interested in prosecuting things like gambling, drinking in the street, immoral conduct, lewd behavior, all this kind of thing. Why would they? Whereas on the other hand, the mid-Victorian elite were quite convinced that the working class was going to the dogs and that they were all utterly morally depraved and corrupt. And that therefore the time had come to have a real crackdown on immoral and lewd behaviour by the public, and therefore you needed a police force to do this. And the prosecution associations just weren't providing that moral reform element. So that was the main reason why they were replaced. Third quick example is one which I alluded to in the earlier session, for those of you there, which is the provision of welfare by voluntary associations. Things like healthcare, which is provided through medical institutes, voluntary bodies which dispensed medicine, provided diagnoses for the poor, and also people of average earnings. The only one that survives, by the way, is one that was set up to do this for animals, the PDSA, the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, which is still going, very successful charity, but the ones that actually provided healthcare for humans have all disappeared, being crowded out by the National Health Service. I have to say, from my own family's experience, that actually the quality and speed of the health treatment you get if you're a dog is quite often higher than what you get in the National Health Service. I can tell some pretty grim stories about my own family experiences in that regard. Now, that was only one part of it, however. What you also had was friendly societies, and in particular things like the Great Affiliated Orders, which by 1900 had enrolled as their members 40% of the entire adult population. And by 1900, 90% of all people of working age were enrolled in a friendly society or a benefit society of some kind or other. And these provided a whole range of welfare benefits: protection against unemployment, insurance against loss of earnings through sickness, insurance and help in finding a job somewhere else. You could move on to another town and you had a kind of token which you would take to the lodge in that town of your affiliated order, and they would then help you find work and find you accommodation and that kind of thing. But also, particularly, a lot of healthcare services done through what was known as the panel system, where they would employ doctors on a flat rate per capita fee. The doctors absolutely hated this, because it stopped them charging so much per individual visit or whatever. And that is why the doctors, in fact, lobbied vigorously to end this system. And in 1911, they got their way. They persuaded the Liberal government, in the person of Lloyd George, to pass the National Insurance Act and stop this. And guess what happened? In the next 10 years, the incomes of doctors more than doubled. What an amazing surprise, eh? Now, the point is that here again you had an enormous range of institutions, purely voluntary, providing goods which we now see as being core public goods. So what this all shows is that it's simply empirically untrue what the economic theory suggests. It is not always the case that you have to provide these goods through the government, or that they have to be provided, if they're going to be provided optimally, through the tax system. There are an enormous range of extremely ingenious measures by which all these kinds of goods can be provided by voluntary private action, sometimes through profit-making entities, sometimes through charities, sometimes through mutual associations and mutual aid, sometimes through simple associations or clubs, as in the case of the prosecution associations. But you can't make the case that it's inevitable that these goods be provided by the state. That simply doesn't stand up empirically. So this leads to some obvious questions. One of them is, well, is there any sort of case for the government? And there is actually a more realistic argument for why the government should provide some of these services. The first is universality. The argument is that some of these goods, if they're provided privately, will simply not be taken up by everybody. There will be some people who, for one reason or other, will not be able or prepared to take part in some kind of institution which will provide them. And the argument is that this has very big negative effects, and that therefore, really, in order to bring everybody inside the pool, you have to have them provided by government. The problem with that argument is that in many cases, this is a case where the cure is worse than the disease. And typically what you find is that the government provision is initially introduced as a supplement to the voluntary provision. This is what happened with the welfare state. When Beveridge created the modern welfare state with the Beveridge Report in 1942, he had no intention whatever of replacing or supplanting voluntary action. Quite the contrary. He thought that that was very important, and he wanted it, in fact, to expand and develop. But what he thought was that there was a kind of gap in the market, and that the state should meet this, but leave the voluntary societies to their own devices. What happened, of course, was that the state crowded out this private provision, because given the advantages the state has in terms of captive revenue and the like, it was always able to undercut and destroy the private providers. And the problem for them, of course, was that people were not prepared to pay twice. If you're paying for something through taxation, why should you then pay additionally for it through a private means? That's the big incentive problem you face. So the thing is, though, in many cases, the cure is actually worse than the disease. It probably makes more sense to be patient and to simply wait for what you might call social entrepreneurship and creative destruction in these kind of areas to do its magic and to introduce innovations and ways of delivering these kind of services in ways of sufficiently low cost. The other argument which is often made is that basically what you want is not just universality but uniformity. This is the idea that what is intolerable is to have significant variations in the quality or nature of the provision of a public service from one part of the country to another. So apparently it's intolerable that you have decent roads in one county but not in another. It's intolerable that you have a kind of welfare system that focuses upon sickness benefit, let's say, in Birmingham, whereas you have one in Manchester that focuses upon education, that kind of thing. This is the so-called postcode lottery argument. Well, this is simply an argument which I would reject. I do not see why there has to be uniformity, but that's an argument you can have with people. You have to realize, though, that's one of the major arguments that was actually made against this kind of non-state provision of these sorts of goods. So when and why was there a big change, finally? Well, the answer is that really the critical decade was between just before World War I and the end of the 1920s. That was when all of this kind of thing came to an abrupt end, particularly as regards friendly societies, but also as regards other things. Now, the kind of policing thing had been brought to a stop by the County and Borough Police Act in 1856, but there had still been lots of other examples of the private supply of public goods. I mentioned friendly societies. There's also what are called learned societies, which were middle-class and working-class associations that provided education in a whole range of subjects, everything from numismatics to botany to science to philosophy, things of that sort. And these are all pretty much destroyed or gutted, with left only a shell left, during the 1920s. Two things happen. The first is on the left-hand side of politics, the Labour Party and the trades union movement, which had previously been intimately associated with this non-state provision of public goods, is taken over by the Fabians. There's this enormous, the creation of the Labour Party's constitution in the early 1920s sees a kind of victory behind the scenes for the Webbs and the Fabian Society over the older working class institutions like particularly the trades unions, but others as well. And two things come from this. One is the idea of rule by experts, which is very much the Webb's big idea, and public managers. The other is the narrowing in the range of what trades unions and other working class organisations thought their main job should be, so that they increasingly thought their only role really was negotiating about wages. And the huge range of other services that they had historically provided becomes seen as a bolt-on or an afterthought and often disappears. So that was one thing. On the right-hand side of politics, on the other hand, in the Conservative Party, in the form of the Baldwin government, you also get the rise of the idea of the professional managerial class. The idea that there's this strange kind of technique called management, which you can apply to almost any human activity, and which basically enables people who belong to some kind of blessed elite to direct the affairs of everybody else. And there's also the idea that what you need to do is to have a government which will promote national development. And this is an idea which becomes steadily more and more powerful. It had begun to appear before World War I with Joseph Chamberlain, but it becomes much more powerful under the Baldwin government. And that's why, amongst other things, for example, they nationalised the electricity industry and created the Central Electricity Generating Board and the National Grid, when previously electricity had been increasingly produced in the same kind of bottom-up, decentralised way that we'd seen with turnpike trusts earlier. They also reorganised the railway industry, although that's not a public good, obviously. And they introduced various other measures which particularly hampered and harmed voluntary action by people providing welfare goods of one kind or another. What lay behind this ultimately was the disastrous experience of the First World War combined with an ideological shift. First of all, what about the First World War? Well, unfortunately, during the First World War, you had this unprecedented growth in state power and mobilization of resources. And it was widely thought, God knows why, but it was, that this had been an amazing success. And in particular, it was thought that the way the Germans had done it was a great success. And the idea was, well, if you can mobilize all these resources for the task of killing the enemy, why not have the government mobilize all these resources for beneficent ends as well? And the perception that the war had shown just how powerful government was and just how good, efficient it could be, because they hadn't actually done the research and discovered what total bloody disaster the whole thing had been, meant that there was an enormous shift in public opinion in favor of extensive action by the state. And then the argument that all these core goods, public goods, gain ground. The other thing, as I say, is an ideological shift, and it is partly a shift in the direction of collectivism, the ideas of collectivism and of an expansive state, but it's also a shift in the idea of having an elite who know what to do for the rest of us. The gentleman in Whitehall knows best, as Douglas J. famously said in 1948. And the combination of those two things is this whole way of providing public goods has been largely forgotten. However, this is my final point, what you should also realize is that we still live in a world where large quantities of public goods are provided privately. There are more private policemen, if you will, in the United States than there are state police officers. There are more private security people here in the UK than there are employees of the public police force. The majority of commercial legal disputes are not handled by the state court system. They're handled by commercial arbitration services. If you enter into almost any kind of significant business deal, or if you buy a whole range of products, you'll notice there's a kind of clause in the small print saying any disputes about this contract and its delivery shall be settled by reference to, and it'll then give the name of an arbitration association. That's because the businesses know that the courts are incompetent, slow, and costly. And they would much rather go to the arbitration associations. So all kinds of public goods, classic public goods, are still provided privately. This is true even for the supposedly quintessential public good of national defense, where, for example, the well-known Israeli political scientist Martin van Creveld has argued in a book he wrote about 10 years ago now, The Rise and Decline of the State, that the modern territorial state has lost its monopoly on the use of force with the rise of private security firms like Blackwater and mercenary companies of one kind and another. He basically thinks this is a dangerous development, but regardless of what you think of it, what is striking is how in the modern world right now, all kinds of public goods, according to the classical definition, are provided privately. And so what I would say to you is that you should try to escape from the mental trap of thinking that no matter, there's this huge area of life that simply has to be the area of public provision, because that simply isn't true. There is an enormous array of goods which appear to be naturally state provided, but which have been provided privately and can easily be done so again. It's simply a matter of recreating the institutions that we used to have. So at that point I'll stop and take any questions that you have.
I want to say thank you, first of all, for that trip through history, because it's certainly a period that I had very little understanding of, and it's definitely an eye-opener in terms of the way that privately organised bodies can organise services that we now think of as government-held. I'm just keen in sort of playing devil's advocate a little bit with, you mentioned prosecution associations,
yeah.
So just to test the rigour of the sort of academic nature of it. You mentioned, obviously, that if you had a plaque outside your house, then
yeah.
chances are that one of the unexpected consequences was that you were funneling, I suppose, an industry to attack, burgle, or otherwise steal from the houses that didn't have plaques. Now, that would seem to create pressure on individuals, of course, to be members of the association, which is a positive thing. As a consequence, what you get is a body that ultimately there is high demand for, I would suspect. When that happens, does that not cause the cost of membership for such an association to go up? Does that not then, because of the scarcity of that good, mean that individuals who are unable to pay for it suffer more as a consequence, just as a strong argument?
No, that doesn't happen. In fact, the empirical evidence is very clear on that the long-run trend in prosecution associations is for the cost of membership to go down. That's because when they initially appear, they're typically quite small. They have about 40 to 50 members. But the long-run evolution is in the direction of much larger societies, like the Barnett Association, which I mentioned, which has over 1,000 members. And that's a response to exactly the rising demand for these things. And what that means is you start to get, as any other line of business, economies of scale, in which unit costs are significantly reduced in various ways. And so consequently, the long-run trend is actually for these things to become cheaper rather than more expensive, because there isn't a fixed supply. It's like any other area of economics. As the demand increases, the supply tends to expand as well, and you start to get larger scale provision, economies of scale, economies of structure and the like. Where there was something that was more problematic, though, is this. Suppose you have a district or an area where there's a lot of prosecution associations. The argument was that what you got was a displacement effect, in which the rogues and vagabonds, the criminals, would go and prey on the neighbouring community where there perhaps wasn't such a high level of social action. Now, it's not clear whether that was true or not. It certainly was widely thought to be true. The empirical research doesn't really confirm or deny whether this is what actually happened. To the extent that it did happen, one would expect that the response ultimately would have been for people to form more effective associations in those other areas. What muddies the waters a bit is that in the 19th century, which is what we're talking about, the criminality in the high crime areas is associated with the Irish, against whom there is extremely strong prejudice. The Irish being regarded as not only Catholics, but utter barbarians, basically, barely better than animals. And so there's a kind of feeling that the high crime you get in areas like, say, Angel Meadow in Manchester, the notorious slum, which was inhabited predominantly by Irish immigrants, is a combination of a completely feckless population which is not prepared to organise itself. Now, in fact, I think that's almost certainly untrue. The problem is that the contemporary sources tend to reflect that prejudice. So it's quite a tricky job for the historian to work out what would have gone on.
I'm interested to know what happens to these voluntary associations in times of economic depression, because of a depression on wages and lack of market confidence. How that affects it, specifically because a lot of social reforms come.
Things like the friendly societies and so on, you mean? The answer is that during trade recessions, they tend to do quite badly in the sense they will lose their members and so on. Now, the way they respond to that is through the creation of national societies, because the big problem initially is that they're very, very local. So if you're in a town where the major employer goes bust and suddenly virtually every adult person is out of work and unable to pay their subs, you go out of business, you become insolvent. But what you get is institutional innovation to deal with that. And the innovation is the creation of the lodge system, where you have a national organization, but with branches around, self-governing branches in different localities. And these are organizations like the Shepherds, the Foresters, the Rechabites, the Gardeners, the Druids, the Royal Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes, and all these kind of things. And what that means is that typically it's quite unusual to have a recession in the 19th century which affects the entire country equally. And so if one part of the country undergoes a pretty severe recession, it's bailed out by the lodges in the other parts of the network. So they become much more resilient. And so by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, you find that, in fact, trade recessions have a much less severe effect on friendly societies than they had done at the start of the 19th century, when it was quite often quite severe. And they build up resources, essentially. One of the things that they obviously do during the good times is to build up significant reserves of one kind or another, which are then paid out during the bad times.
What about post-Great Depression?
Well, the thing is that in the 1930s, by the 1930s, they've already lost a large part of their role because of the effects of the 1911 National Insurance Act. They're still quite robust, though. There are still lots and lots of members of friendly societies in the 30s and 40s, which is why Beveridge wanted to give them quite an important place in his scheme. But then what happens is that they just basically disappear, most of them, in the 1950s. They're crowded out by the growth of the welfare state. Not all of them. The Oddfellows, who I mentioned, which I belong to, I am an Oddfellow myself, they survive. And I think one of the reasons is they take a critical strategic decision not to become just a straightforward friendly insurance company and to keep up the lodge system. And they're actually doing very well, whereas some of the others, like the Foresters and the Shepherds, who decided to just basically become an insurance company, have not done anything like as well. And it appears that giving up the lodge system was a big mistake for them. The reason, I mean, just not to go on too long, but the reason why that was a mistake is that the lodge provides a lot of goods other than straightforward insurance goods. It's a club, basically. So you go there for conviviality, as they called it, drinking, socializing, entertainment, all that kind of thing. So there's a whole range of other private goods provided through the lodge. And if you lose them, then you're basically just in competition with commercial insurance companies. And the commercial insurance companies don't have the overheads that go with being a friendly society. Middle left, yeah.
Cheers. You said that at one point 90% of the working population of Britain was covered by the health panels.
That's right, yeah.
The form of private insurance.
Well, one kind or other friendly societies, I would qualify
Yes,
that, yeah.
Sorry. But privately covered in some way. I was wondering if that extended to their families or to non-working people. I was wondering that.
It depends. A lot of them have widows' benefits. That's very common. One of the sort of major limitations of friendly societies from our point of view was that they were typically for men. There were parallel organisations very often for women, but the major ones were men, but they provided household benefits, so they provided benefits for dependents. So if you died, for example, a common benefit, almost universal, was to pay for your funeral, but also they would provide a widow's pension or widow's relief. There was relief of that kind for your dependents, your children, if they're below a certain age. And also they would get the sickness benefit. So in a way, it was households that were members of these societies through the person of the male head of the household. And what that meant that the members of the household, the children of non-working age, the wife, they got the health and other benefits. There was, however, one of the problems that they had not yet resolved at the time they finally got, if you like, pushed off the stage by the government, was what to do with casualised labour. The real problem was not so much unemployment, actually. The real problem that they were struggling with and trying to find ways around in the early 20th century was that of casualised labour, people who had work but on an irregular, casual basis, which was quite a major phenomenon in certain parts of the country, particularly London, the southeast, from the 1880s onwards. That's much more difficult, because if you have an income but it's not a predictable income, it's quite risky to tie up part of your income in a regular sub. Economic rationality says you ought to do that, but the trouble is most people, if you know you've got money in this week, but you're not sure if you're going to get money in next week, you're very reluctant to enter into something that requires a sustained outgoing commitment. And that was something that they were, to be honest, struggling with a bit in the 1890s, 1900s. I think they probably would have resolved it, but we don't know for sure, because by that point, they'd begun to decline quite sharply, thanks to the policies of the Lloyd George and Baldwin governments. Yep, the front here.
Hi, it's again question about World 2. One is, why do you think there's such a level of ignorance and lack of knowledge within trade unions and the labour movement about these working class mutuals? And also, what's your opinion on Maurice Glassman and Blue Labour?
Right. It's not just amongst the Labour Party that there's a great ignorance about this. It's just more surprising in that case, because this is part of their history, really. It's an extraordinary example, I'm afraid, of how the writing of history and historical research works. The historiography of the British state and public life, if you like, is dominated by what technically is called a Whiggish view of history. That's to say, you have a narrative written by the historians in which everything is seen as leading up to where we are now. And things that happened in the past that don't fit into that story are just ignored and not studied. So everything is seen as leading up to 1942, when we apparently enter into the Promised Land, or 1948, depending on your chronology. And the modern state, as it is now, is seen as being what all of historical evolution was leading up to that point. And so the things that don't fit into that story, like all these private ways of providing public goods, are just not written about. And if they're not written about and not studied, people won't know about them. That's quite simple. That's bad historiography, by the way. I mean, that is not what you are meant to do as a historian. That's committing one of the classic sins of historical research, which is presentism. You're supposed to always view the past on its own terms. Which is difficult, but that's what you should try and do. What do I think about Blue Labour? Well, I have mixed feelings about Blue Labour and Maurice Glassman. Blue Labour, for those of you who aren't aware of it, is a movement within the Labour Party. Leading figures are Maurice Glassman, Lord Glassman as he now is, John Cruddas, the MP for, is it Barking? Yes, it is Barking. A number of other people who are trying to, if you like, rediscover the alternative traditions within the British Labour movement to Fabian centralism. And in particular, they're trying to rediscover these traditions of voluntary action, working class collective action through various means that I was talking about just now. I like all that very much. I think that's an extremely important endeavour. On the other hand, I'm not too keen on some of the other ideas they have, notably the nationalism and the cultural conservatism. However, I have to say that does often go with it. A lot of these organisations are quite culturally conservative, historically. They're very often associated with temperance, by the way, particularly the liberal ones. There's a strong association in the 19th century between liberalism, laissez-faire, and temperance, which strikes us as strange, but they didn't see it as strange. They saw the whole set of things as being a package. It was tied together by the idea of character, because the idea was that to be free, you had to have a certain kind of character. You had to be self-governing, responsible, and independent. And the idea was that if you were a drunkard, you couldn't be any of these things, hence the interest in temperance. Now, of course, the thing is, the important point to make here is, I'm not talking about or advocating, nor would I ever advocate that we simply recreate or try to bring back some kind of vanished golden age of the 19th century. That's futile, quite apart from anything else. But also, things have moved on. What I'm saying is that we can revive the principle, if you like, of voluntary action to provide collective goods of various kinds and public goods. But the forms this take, given changes in technology, changes in social life and the like, and working life since the 19th or early 20th century, the forms this will take will be quite different from what they were then in many cases, although the same in some. And this is where there's lots of scope for social innovation, if you will, or social entrepreneurship. Back there? No?
My question follows on from that. Given the kind of voluntary grassroots means by which people provision public goods was an outcome of the kind of socioeconomic circumstances of the times, and now these goods have been heavily monopolized and consolidated industrially by the state. How is it, presumably you say we shouldn't just try and create lodges again, that would be futile, but how should we try to provision public goods privately? Because, I mean, just kind of selling a bit of the NHS services to a private pharmaceutical company presumably doesn't have the benefits of one of those grassroots kind of mutual associations. Yep. So,
absolutely.
I mean, how do we do it?
Oh, well, in one sense, if I knew the answer, it would already be done, if you know what I mean. But having said that, in some cases, yes, you do go back to the old methods. I actually think that the lodge system, on the evidence of the society I belong to, the Oddfellows, is the way to go. Federated local clubs that provide some kind of public service is actually an extremely useful kind of organizational structure. What kind of things do we do? Well, for example, suppose you live in a part of a local authority which is particularly crime-prone or has serious problems of public order in the sense of low-grade vandalism, misbehavior in public places. What you can do, and what I think it would be very good for people to do, and they are indeed often doing it, is to simply club together and form associations and bodies that will provide that kind of good. And the form this takes was then worked out very often on a trial and error basis. Now, the problem is when the government, with often very good intentions, tries to help or promote these things, because that brings two problems. One is that there's a sort of fearful condescension where middle-class professionals are sent out from Whitehall and basically sort of say, oh, well, we have this template here for an association that you should set up, and this is what you should do, and let me tell you how to do it. And not surprisingly, this is resented, because as I say, it's fearfully patronizing, basically. The other problem is that if you get aid or assistance from the government in the form of financial aid, which is, again, a common phenomenon, that invariably comes with strings, because the Treasury, for good reasons, is not going to just give out public money willy-nilly. It's going to insist on, certain strings being attached to it, and that, of course, destroys the autonomy. So, in a way, what I think you should do is, this is true, people in general should do, is to just ignore the government. If you have a problem, just act to do something about it. And the major problem is, well, there's two problems. One is resources. However, as I said earlier on today, because we as a society are so much richer in monetary terms than we were 100 years ago, even with the kind of levels of taxation that people are paying now, there's still actually quite a lot of surplus resources, if you will, also resources that could be devoted to action of this kind. The other more significant element is time, actually, and in particular the way in which it eats into entertainment time. Oscar Wilde famously observed that the problem with socialism was too many meetings. And that's true for a lot of these things. If there's lots of meetings, people don't do that. That's why I think it's very important they're combined with fun, basically. You may have noticed that the place where most of these organizations were based and got set up was the pub. And I honestly think that if you want to promote effective action, collective action to provide a lot of public goods, then the way to do it is through linking that voluntary action to entertainment of one kind or another. That way, it isn't going to be seen as such a sacrifice of your time if you get involved in doing something. On the other hand, there are large areas where it can be provided, lots of public goods can be provided through straightforward commercial action. So there's, and take the extreme case I mentioned earlier, which is that of national defence. I mean, companies like Blackwater or Sandline are commercial profit-making organisations. So that's an area where it isn't voluntary action, it's a matter of just commercial profit-making activity. Similarly with arbitration associations, which are profit-making firms providing a service to individuals and businesses. So there's a whole range of different forms of private action and which one you use depends on pragmatic considerations like what's the most effective, what's the most cost-effective way of doing it, what fits in best with the particular kind of needs for the service, and so on. It's hard to predict which one will be best in any given situation. Chap over there at the back.
Right, okay. What do you think is the potential of a new police force which is privatised, where the public would have to access the police via paying a monthly fee, which would inevitably improve the quality of the policing public can access, and also save the government a lot of public expense?
I think the prospects for reform of the police force are actually quite good in some ways, but the reason is not a good one. That is that there's been a quite sharp collapse in public confidence in the police in recent years, and that collapse is actually well justified. There was a recent report, official report, which indicated that there's widespread corruption in major urban police forces in particular, not just the Metropolitan Police, but several of the other metropolitan county police forces, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands in particular, attracting attention. One of the important things to realise is that there are actually two different functions that the police service performs. We're actually quite unusual in that respect. Most countries in Europe have more than one police force. The typical thing is to have at least two, usually three or even four. And one service is investigation and prosecution of crime. Now, that's one which would be quite easy to privatise. But in a way, I think privatising is the wrong way of thinking about it. What we should do is revive associations to carry out that function. And you can still, it's perfectly possible to bring a private criminal prosecution these days. It's just very rare. And given the unbelievable incompetence of the criminal justice system, it seems to me that there's an enormous, if you like, social entrepreneurial opportunity to create private bodies which carry out the function of investigating and prosecuting crime. One thing to say, by the way, is that there isn't quite as much of that as people imagine. There are large parts of the country where crime is extremely rare. And in the last 10 to 12 years, there's been a significant decline in crime. It peaks in the mid-1990s, and it's been going down really quite steeply ever since. And much to everyone's surprise, the decline has actually accelerated during the recent economic downturn. Although that doesn't surprise the criminologists, but it surprised other people. On the other hand, the other policing good is public order. Now, I actually think that should be separated from the good of investigating crimes. Now, maybe you do want to provide that through the government, or alternatively, you provide it at a local level through some kind of local service, the difficulty is it has to be bound up with a private good of some kind or other, because otherwise you will fall foul of the classic free rider problem. So as I say, this is an area for experimentation, but I think in the first area of policing service, there's ample scope at the moment for private action to supplement what the police are doing, and doing not very well, quite frankly, in many parts of the country. Yeah, chap in there. Yellow coat there.
Just going back to the statistic about 90% of people being covered by, was it mutual societies?
All kinds of societies.
As much as obviously it's a smaller amount, with that last 10%, who were they? And therefore, if they were the poorest, does it matter?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Who were this 10%? Well, they're a mixture of three different categories of people, really. The first is the people I mentioned who are in casualised labour, in the casualised trades, particularly in London and the South East. I mean, that 10% figure is for the country as a whole. That 10% is much higher than 10% in London, interestingly. If you look at the great friendly societies, they're disproportionately concentrated in the industrial districts in the north of England and Scotland. So the Rechabites' headquarters is in Salford, the Oddfellows' headquarters is in Manchester, the Shepherds are headquartered in, I think it's Nottingham. It's all north of England. London, by contrast, has an economy with a lot more casualised labour, and there the proportion of people not registered in a friendly society is much higher. So that's the first group, people who are in casualised work of one kind or another. The other group are what the Victorians used to call, very revealingly, the residuum. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means the kind of people who've been left behind by the march of progress, essentially. And it's a combination of the very, very poor and also the feckless. And they did actually distinguish between the two. They were quite aware there was a kind of distinction between these two groups. And if you look at things like Charles Booth's famous survey of poverty in London, he clearly identifies the districts in London where he thinks this bottom 10% is concentrated, and then tries to distinguish between the completely hopeless and incorrigible ones who live in places like the Jago, and the ones who are just really, really poor because they lack skills or they're recent immigrants, that kind of thing. Now, the interesting question is what could have been done to resolve this? What was tending to be done at that time was the work of an organisation called the Charity Organisation Society, which was a body that developed the technique of what we would now call social work, casework as they called it. The aim of which was to actually empower people by giving them the skills and knowledge they needed to achieve economic independence. And that was a huge movement in late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. Now, what we can do is look at the trajectory. That 90% figure, about 40 to 50% of the population belong to societies that bring considerable substantial benefits, basically, either affiliated orders or they belong to what are called national benefit societies like the Liverpool Victoria, the Heart of Oak. These are national societies that don't have a lodge system. They're much more like an insurance company. The other 30% or so who are belong to very small benefit societies, or they belong to a burial society. Because the one thing that almost everybody wanted to have, regardless of how poor they were, was what they called a good send-off. The worst possible thing, an utter shame, was to have a pauper's funeral, basically, and be buried in an unmarked grave. But the long-term trend is for more and more people to be joining the large, complex societies. So it's always dangerous to assume that just because a trend had been going on, it was going to continue in that direction. That's dangerous reasoning. But it does seem that had that trend not been interrupted by the Great War and by the 1911 Act, that you would have seen more and more, people involved in those kind of societies. And I think, as I said, they probably would have developed ways of dealing with the problem of casualised labour in port cities like London. There's always going to be a residuum. There's always going to be a hard core of difficult cases, basically. And that's where I think you do need something like the Charity Organisation Society as a way of responding to that. Yep.
Is it just a case that the people who are part of these associations just had low expectations of what would be provided, and now we've got people demanding a lot more?
That's a good question. I mean, it's very hard to know sort of Measuring expectations over time and trying to work out what has changed is actually quite difficult. In one sense, people do have higher expectations now because we live in a much wealthier society. And so what is regarded as acceptable changes over time. So, I mean, not to sound like an old man here, but I remember growing up when it was quite unusual to have central heating. And I remember growing up in a house where, you'd wake up in the winter and there'd be ice on the inside of your bedroom window. And you would basically, have your clothes in a pile by the bed, and you'd reach out with one arm and get the clothes and get dressed under the bedclothes, because the alternative was to leap out of bed and expose yourself to the icy blast and so on. Now the point is, these days people would regard that as utterly unacceptable, intolerable in fact, but it was quite normal. I think it was only about 10%. Actually, Winston Churchill famously observed that the number of houses with central heating in Roman Britain was higher than it was in Britain in 1950. And he was quite correct too. That is empirically true. So there is a difference in standards and that kind. I think what is more important is not so much the absolute expectations that people have, it's the relative expectations. In other words, what do people who are in the bottom 20% think is a reasonable level of sort of income provision or service or whatever it might be, compared to what is enjoyed by the majority of their society? I don't think there has been that much of a change, actually, in that respect. I think that in terms of the relative expectations, people still think that the minimum, however you define it, is pretty much a standard distance away from whatever the kind of average in Britain at a given time is. And the question is, how is that national minimum, as it was called, to be achieved? So that was actually an idea invented by the Webbs. And Sidney Webb thought that the only way you could get a national minimum was by having the state provide it on a universalistic basis. That's what the argument was about. But I think what is worth saying, by the way, is that he ran into a lot of opposition. If you read the history of the time, all these friendly societies, voluntary associations were violently opposed to Lloyd George's state insurance scheme, which they saw as a step towards servitude. And also middle-class takeover of their institutions. So they were not happy at all. So Sidney Webb's argument that, you do need a national minimum, and this is the way to do it, their response was, we like this idea of a national minimum, Sidney, but, let us do it ourselves, not have you hand it down graciously from Passfield, thank you very much. Yep.
I was just wondering how some of these solutions might apply to education provision, particularly for children rather than higher.
That's a huge area which is incredibly understudied. In the 19th century, the common notion, the mythology, is that before the 1870 Education Act, which created compulsory primary school education, the Forster Act as it's usually called, there was mass lack of education. E.G. West, Ted West, was able to show quite conclusively, almost 30 years ago, that this was not true. The Newcastle Committee, which was a Royal Commission of Inquiry that inquired into the education of the labouring classes, as they called them, in 1862, found that, in fact, again, 90% of working class children were enjoying some kind of education. A fellow called Phil Gardner, who I can definitely say is an impartial observer as far as I'm concerned, because he's actually a trot. Phil wrote a book, a Socialist Workers' Party member. Phil wrote a book about 20 years ago again called The Lost Elementary Schools of Victorian England, which is all about these dame schools, small schools, completely private, charging a fee, which provided basic education to the great majority of the working population. So there's all these commercial, often profit-making educational institutions which are actually providing a pretty successful educational service. You also have, of course, organised societies, particularly religious ones, things like the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, which is the big Anglican educational charity. Its non-conformist equivalents, which provide, actually run schools, have whole chains of schools, provide all sorts of flexible education. And then you have the enormous sector of adult education, which is what are called learned societies. Societies formed, and these are actually interesting because they're societies which are trans-class. They're one of the places where middle-class and working-class Victorians mix together. And they provide education in a whole range of subjects, everything from history to archaeology to foreign languages to the classics to science zoology, botany, astronomy, you name it. Again, enormously effective and very, very widespread. Just to give you one kind of anecdotal story about that, a colleague of mine called Brian Lund, former colleague, he was a counsellor up in Oldham, and he met some chaps who had formerly worked at Mather Platt, which is this huge textile manufacturing firm. They made textile machinery in Oldham. And in 1929, the factory was boarded up, basically, and shut down because of the worldwide slump. And these guys clubbed together in their learned society and paid for a lecturer from Manchester University to give them lectures on Immanuel Kant, which seems like a different world to what we have now, actually. So there was a huge array of voluntary provision of education, highly complex, highly pluralistic, very, very varied, no simple monopoly provision, and under the direct control of ordinary people. Why did this educational voluntarism, as they called it, get removed in first the 670 Act and then in the 1902 Act? Well, very revealing. They felt that they weren't getting the right kind of, the elite, felt that the ordinary people, middle class and working class, were not getting the right kind of education. Above all, they weren't being taught about national identity. And they weren't being given the right kind of, they thought, moral education. And so it's quite straightforward. This is a separate lecture I've got, which some people here I think have heard. The modern school is essentially an institution which was invented by the Prussians in 1807. And the central function of the modern school is to act as an instrument of indoctrination, designed to produce productive, loyal, and obedient citizens. And the main goal of the state education system is to take intelligent, independent-minded, and inquiring children and turn them into conformist dullards, which for a while it was very successful at. Fortunately, it's now breaking down. A friend of mine, Sheldon Richman, I heard him give a talk many years ago which had a revolutionary effect on my thinking, and Sheldon says, we libertarians think that the modern state education system is a terrible failure. Well, actually, we're wrong. When you realize what its actual real function is, it's a brilliant success. That was why I think that the move to set up the Forster Act in 1870 was actually a terrible disaster. And the interesting question is why that happened and why it was that the voluntarists, people like Edward Baines and others, basically lost the argument. It's an interesting question of intellectual and political history. I would add, by the way, give you a heads up here, a friend of mine called George H. Smith is producing a reader which will come out as both an e-book and an actual physical book on educational voluntarism. And George knows more about this subject than anybody else on the planet. And I say that quite straightforwardly. I mean, it's a low bar because not many people know a lot about it, but George definitely knows a huge amount. And he's producing this reader of primary documents with a big 4,000-word introduction by himself. It should be coming out early next year, spring of 2015, so I strongly recommend, if you're interested in that you should get it. George H. Smith. George also wrote a brilliant book about the history of classical liberalism, which came out, The Tradition of Liberty, I think it's called, came out about a year ago. I recommend it really strongly. And in that, there is about a 4-page section on the debate about educational voluntarism in 19th century England. He's also got a couple of other books. I always like to plug George. He wrote a really good book many years ago called Atheism, the Case Against God, which is one of the sort of classic works of free thought in recent times. Yep, up the back there.
Thank you, Steve, for that talk. I know you spoke a lot about what caused the rise in the welfare states, and you alluded to World War I and obviously the reforms after World War II. But obviously there were a lot of reforms before that, like the so-called liberal reforms in the first 11 years of the 20th century, and also in the US, like the populist movement.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could maybe shed some light on what caused that. Was it just the government wanting to get larger, or was there a genuinely a popular demand for it?
There's not a popular demand for it in both the United States and Britain, and indeed in other countries like Belgium, France, Germany. There's widespread popular grassroots opposition to this process. It's an elite-driven process, which comes from a rising professional elite, essentially,
Harold Perkin, this very famous British social historian, wrote a great book about 40 years ago now called The Rise of Professional Society. And he describes how, it's specifically about Britain, but it transfers to other countries at the time as well. You get the rise of a professional class, which includes people like the doctors, who I mentioned earlier, professional managers, or social workers, all kinds of people like that. And this class becomes the agenda-setting group of people in society increasingly. You see this very clearly in the United States with the idea of public administration being developed by Wilson. So it's not a popular grassroots demand, but what it is the political agenda driven by an emergent elite tends to go this way. However, I will qualify that. Why was the popular resistance not successful, and why did people actually buy into this eventually? Peter Lindert, British actually, but working in America, economic historian, wrote a very big book about the origins of the welfare state, basically. And he shows, I think, pretty conclusively that the key tipping point in every country is when the proportion of old people in the population goes above a certain critical level. Once that happens, within about 10 years, you find a big expansion of state welfare. And the reason, I think, is that in addition to the class interests and ideology that I just described, you also get a widespread desire for security on the part of the mass of the population. And in particular, there is the problem of what to do with all these old people, because, you know, the life expectancy, one of the beneficial effects of 19th century capitalism is that life expectancy is shot up. So suddenly lots of people are living a lot longer, but there is the question of what happens to these people when they can no longer physically work. So if you go to the workhouses, the poor law institutions in the 1890s in England, they're just basically full of old people. That's what they are now. They've become old people's homes, essentially. And so the critical issue in country after country is old age pensions. That's the critical thing. And the reason why that ideology, elite ideology, was ultimately able to win the day in the face of strong opposition from many, many people further down the social scale is because of the widespread desire for security in old age, I think. Which is why the crisis of old age provision is actually such a big one, because as Mark was saying at lunchtime, there's just no way that the commitments that states currently have to their elderly population are ever going to be met in full. And so that's what created the welfare state originally, and that's what ultimately is going to undermine it because of the way they've chosen to fund it. Time for one more question, I think. Yeah, lady down here.
The idea of setting up friendly societies is a very attractive one, and it seems to me that the most sensible place to start these organisations would be in big metropolitan areas.
Yeah.
However, it strikes me that the same problems remain. For example, we have 0 hours contracts, we've got migrant labour. Do you have any ideas on overcoming those problems so that we can set some more up?
That's an extremely good question. 0 hours contracts is basically our contemporary equivalent of casualised working conditions. It's exactly the same kind of institution. Better than no work at all, of course, but still problematic from the point of view of being in control of your own life, really. Seems to me that what we need here is the revival of institutions that were also an important part of the story that I didn't touch on, because they're not really public goods, and that is various kinds of financial institutions which provide a way of smoothing out and evening out income and a stable place to park your money and acquire credit for people who have low or erratic incomes. Now, here, I'm a big fan of credit unions, actually. I think credit unions are a very important institution that we need to develop a lot more. Now, contrary to the Archbishop of Canterbury, I don't see credit unions as being in competition with things like payday lenders. I think they're two quite different kind of services that are being provided there. If anything, they're complementary rather than contradictory. But that's one of the ways of getting around that kind of problem. The other thing is this, that setting up organisations like this, I would say this is where we need to experiment and try things out. It could well be the case, for example, that we no longer need to do things at a local level, because one of the great advantages of modern technology is that the transactions costs of organising people collectively over a large area are much, much less due to the advent of new social media and the like. In the 19th century, what made possible things like the national orders was the penny post, because that reduced, and the railway, because that reduced the cost of travelling and communicating with other parts of the country. Now we've got a situation where you don't even need to send physical messages. The cost has gone down again. So it could well be that we can develop new forms of organisation that don't require so much face-to-face contact as we had in the past. One thing that's definitely the case is it doesn't make sense to set up organisations that have permanent buildings. That's one of the lessons that the Oddfellows have learned. They basically got rid of most of their lodge buildings because there's very high fixed costs, high upkeep, all the rest of it. You don't need to do that. You can just hire and rent accommodation as and when you need it. And that gives you a much greater degree of flexibility. So I do think actually that there are all kinds of new possibilities open to us now. Right, I think I better stop there. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming to this.